Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Ridgefield and Fairfield County's Native Populations. My name is Kate Mozier-Tichy, and this time we'll be talking about the Ramapo Village Indians. So, identifying Katona and his band has proved a little confusing. The village is called Ramapo, but we can't confuse it with the Ramapo of the modern tribal nation of Ramapo Lenape in New Jersey. They are two distinct groups. And Chief Katona's connection to his predecessors Ponas and Waskusu is a little unknown, a little unclear. Their people were called the Toquam and Shippen, respectively. And of course, we know the Katona's people were called the Ramapo. We will revisit this in a little bit as to how we know they're related. We don't quite know how. So according to the Indian Tribes of North America by John Swanton in 1952, Ramapo Village, says near Ridgefield, Connecticut, that's our guy, was listed under the Tonki-Teke Sachem-ship. So this Sachem-ship is listed as being in mainly Fairfield County, between 5 Mile River and Fairfield and extending inland to Danbury and even into Putnam and Dutchess counties today in New York. And that is listed under Wappinger, from the same root as Wapanaki and Wampanoag, and this actually means Easterners. The Wappinger Indian were a confederacy of Algonquin Indians. About 7 tribes would usually become united in times of warfare under a war chief. And they were usually represented by the totem of the wolf. So the Wappinger Indians were closely related to the Lenape and the Mohicans to the north. They had similar languages, especially the Lenape. And they were primarily in Westchester and Dutchess counties in New York, what we call them today. But they also extended into parts of Connecticut, such as Ridgefield, which is just over the border. We know that the Wappinger were in the area since at least 6000 BCE because there has been archaeology at Mount Julian in Fishkill, New York, that has revealed that the Wappingers lived there on and off. And the Wappinger culture itself, with the development of agriculture, developed about 2,000 years ago. So each tribe was generally split into clans and bands led by a sachem, which was usually had a representative animal totem, such as the wolf. Lineage was traced patrilineally, father to son, which is how we know that Katona must be related to his predecessors, but we don't know quite how. It's never explained in any of the sources, as far as we can tell. And actually, the fact that they were patrilineal was a little odd because a lot of Native American tribes were actually matrilineal. But so the Wappingers were semi-sedentary. They moved between different camps, and that depended on the season and food availability. So generally in the summer, they'd be down by the beach. In winter, they'd move a little more inland. They lived in wigwams and longhouses, depending on the camps and the needs, which were usually framed in wood, like branches, saplings, and sidings of hides or bark. And they also grew maize, beans, squash, watermelons, and pumpkins. And maize, beans, and squash we know of as the Three Sisters garden. And we believe that there were about 5,000 to 8,000 Wappinger at the time of European colonization. So where did the Ramapo go? So as we know, between 1708 and 1739, Chief Katona and his band of Indians sold the land around their village at Ramapo to the settlers of Ridgefield. And again, we believe that they moved west to Westchester with fellow Wappingers, where we know that Katona had land. In fact, Katona, New York is named for him. And we do know that his descendants still live in the area. There was actually a New York Times article from a few years ago about something they were protesting. But as the European settlers encroached on their areas and they sold the lands to them, the Wappinger moved out of the area. So in New York and New Jersey, there was a movement of disenfranchised to the Ramapo Mountains. Later, these would be called the Jackson Whites. We believe that they could be part of this group. This group was generally a mixed group of formerly enslaved people and other disenfranchised natives, very similar to the Maroon communities in the Caribbean. This has actually proved a little difficult for them, provided some difficulties for them, which we'll discuss a little bit later. We know that the last Wappinger sachem was Daniel Nimham. He died in 1778, and he actually fought in the Revolution. But by 1750, the populations of Wappinger had just melted away, and Wappinger culture and society as we knew it kind of disappeared. So the Ramapo and Lenape may be modern descendants based on their migration. But they also possibly moved to other New York and New Jersey tribes, such as the Stockbridge Munsee, Iroquois, and even there is evidence of some going up to Canada. There is also evidence of there being Wappinger descendants today in Wisconsin. So they got spread out quite a bit. But before we make any solid connections between the Ramapo Lenape and the Ramapo, or any modern tribes and a historic tribe, we have to take this into account. So this is from the Ramapo Lenape Tribal Nation website. In it, they basically say, or as it says, the written history of the native people in this area has always been left to the non-native community to write. And with their ignorance of Lenape ways and language, their documentation was seldom accurate. So basically, we have to leave it up to them to tell their own story. We don't quite understand, like we can't tell how Katona got his power, but that doesn't mean that he didn't and he wasn't legitimate. We have to let them tell their own story as Europeans and Westerners, but it's difficult because actually recently the Ramapo Lenape were denied federal recognition due to their history and their lack of written history, which is disappointing. And you can actually read more about that. Which brings me to our further reading. You can read more about their struggle to be recognized on the Ramapo Lenape website. And I particularly endorse Connecticut's Indigenous Peoples by Lucienne Levine. It's very interesting, very, very informative. And she's actually a researcher up at the Institute of American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut, and her work is great. So yes, thank you for listening, guys. I hope you learned a little something today.